The Young Lords were a working-class, predominantly Puerto Rican movement. They were an explicitly socialist group, and they drew influence from national liberation movements around the globe. They emerged as part of the larger New Left, but as advocates for Puerto Rican independence, they were part of an even older tradition of resistance. The Puerto Rican independence movement, like the New Left, was the subject of the FBI's counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO. Unsurprisingly, the Young Lords as an organization was targeted by the FBI. This is Still Spying, presented by Defending Rights and Dissent, and I'm your host, Chip Gibbons. In a little bit, I'm going to be talking to Professor Johanna Fernández, the author of a book about the Young Lords. She also spent a significant amount of time working to have the NYPD release its own political surveillance files, those of its Red Squad. But first, let's talk about the larger background of political activism and political repression in which the Young Lords story took place. In the 1960s and 1970s, the movement against the Vietnam War and struggles against domestic oppression gave rise to what's called the New Left. Many of these groups adopted internationalist frameworks and were explicit in drawing inspiration from national liberation struggles taking place in the global South. This was true not only of groups like the Black Panther Party or the Young Lords, which struggled against racial and national oppression within the U.S., but even groups like the Gay Liberation Front, whose name was purposely styled after those of the Algerian National Liberation Front and the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. In May 1968, following the student uprising at Columbia University, the FBI initiated a new counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO operation, against the New Left. It was one of the last official COINTELPRO operations, and in the words of the Church Committee, it was the most vaguely defined and haphazard of the COINTELPRO operations. This was given in part to the lack of, in the words of the Church Committee, any clear definition of the New Left and its mandate to expose, disrupt, and otherwise neutralize the activities of groups or persons connected with it. The Church Committee explains that the FBI's justification for starting a new COINTELPRO operation against the New Left was as follows. The nation was undergoing an era of disruption and violence which was caused by large extent by individuals generally connected with the New Left. Some of these activists were urging revolution and calling for the defeat of the United States in Vietnam. The problem was not just they committed unlawful acts, but they also falsely in quotation marks of course, alleged police brutality, and that they scurrilously attacked the director and the bureau in an attempt to hamper the FBI's investigations and drive us off college campuses. Imagine attacking the FBI or its director, J. Edgar Hoover, for their political surveillance. The Young Lords were very much part of the milieu of the New Left, and it's therefore not surprising they were targets of the FBI. This alone probably would have brought them FBI attention, but it's also important to remember that while the Young Lords were a left-wing group based on the U.S. mainland, the repression against them should be considered in part of the larger history of the repression against Puerto Rican independence movements. Puerto Rico is a U.S. colony. Even those familiar with the U.S.'s abuses abroad or at home may be shocked by the history of violence and terror the U.S. government has visited upon the people of Puerto Rico. Possession of a Puerto Rican flag, including in one's home at one point on the island, could earn one 10 years in jail. The leader of the Nationalist Party of Puerto Rico, Pedro Albizu Campos, suffered immense repression. He was arrested a number of times, first in 1936, and he was held until 1947. He was arrested again in 1950, to be pardoned in 1953, only to have his pardon revoked. He was held under torturous, inhumane conditions and was very likely subjected to human radiation experiments that contributed to his ill health and eventual death. He suffered a stroke in 1954, and being on the verge of death in 1964, was finally released. He died in 1965. In 1937, on Palm Sunday, the Nationalist Party had a parade protesting his arrest. Authorities opened fire on the peaceful parade, killing 19 people and injuring 200. This is known as the Ponce Massacre. During the Utah Uprising, the U.S. put the island under martial law, and the U.S. Air Force, using Thunderbolt warplanes, attacked two cities, Utah and Hialeah. The bombing of Hialeah left 70% of the city destroyed. Remember, Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens by birth. The Nationalist Party of Puerto Rico would at one point be added to the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations, a key tool of repression during the McCarthy era developed to attack communist movements. Because of the unique status of Puerto Rico, there was a special role for the FBI to play here in this shameful legacy of colonialist violence and terror. In 2000, during a House Appropriations Committee, New York Representative Jose Serrano asked then FBI Director Louis Freire about rumors of FBI action against Puerto Rican independence activists. To the shock of the congressman, and probably many other people, the FBI conceded such rumors were true, and he stated he wanted to, quote-unquote, see if we can address some of the egregious, illegal action, maybe criminal action, that occurred in the past. He then moved, the FBI director did, to declassify and release 1.8 million pages of FBI files on Puerto Rico. The New York Times described the files, which stemmed from 1936 to 1995, as the following. They track everything from the Puerto Rican Independence Party, still active and known as PIP, to student demonstrations and worker strikes to bomb explosions and assassination attempts as part of an armed struggle. FBI surveillance in Puerto Rico was mass surveillance. As part of these 1.8 million documents that were released that showed the FBI's surveillance of Campos, we also wrote about a program called the Carpetas, which included the opening of 100,000 files on individuals in Puerto Rico, the vast majority of those files being about political surveillance. It wasn't just the Carpetas program, though. In the early 1960s, J. Edgar Hoover would authorize COINTELPRO operations against quote-unquote groups seeking independence for Puerto Rico. And this is far from history. As recently as about 2019, FBI classifications of domestic terrorism movements identified Puerto Rican independence extremists as one of the persistent domestic extremist movements in the U.S. In the next segment, we're going to talk to Professor Fernández about who the Young Lords were, what they believed in, and what the FBI did. We'll also hear about how she successfully fought to liberate the files of the NYPD's Red Squad. But first, whether you're a longtime listener or this is your first episode, I want to thank you for listening to the Still Spying podcast. Still Spying is a limited series released in conjunction with Defending Rights in Dissent's report, Still Spying on Dissent, the enduring legacy of FBI First Amendment abuse. We have only a few more episodes left, including a really great one I can't wait to share with you about the FBI's role in McCarthyism. But we are coming to a close. I invite you to seek out the work of Defending Rights in Dissent. In addition to battling FBI political surveillance, one of our other top issues has been the abuse of the Espionage Act against national security whistleblowers and the press. After this podcast is over, we will be working on a new podcast series exploring issues relating to whistleblowers, truth tellers, and others who expose government wrongdoing at great personal cost. I invite you to be on the lookout for it. In the past, we've discussed how the FBI waged a vicious war on Black dissent. Today, we turn to the FBI's campaign against the Young Lords, a political organization led predominantly by poor and working-class Puerto Rican youth. To discuss this, we are extremely privileged to be joined by Professor Johanna Fernández. Professor Fernández is the Associate Professor of History at Baruch College of the City University of New York. She was the editor of Writing on the Wall, Selected Prison Writings of Mumia Abu-Jamal, and the author of the highly acclaimed recent book, The Young Lords, A Radical History. She also led a decade-long struggle to liberate the files of the NYPD's Red Squad. Thank you so much for joining us on Still Spying.
Thank you so very much for inviting me.
So let's start with the big question. Who were the Young Lords?
The Young Lords are the Puerto Rican counterpart of the Black Panther Party. They emerged in the late 1960s. They were self-proclaimed Puerto Rican revolutionary nationalists who amplified the quiet colonial project of the United States on the island for mainland activist organizers and the public to discover, to find out about. They were also self-proclaimed socialists, and they were a product of the period and were influenced and radicalized by the civil rights and Black Power movements, the women's movement, the anti-war movement, but also the decolonization struggles that were happening across the world in the continents of Asia and Africa. And they were mostly led by poor and working class Puerto Rican youth. However, the Young Lords were distinct in that despite being self-proclaimed Puerto Rican revolutionary nationalists, the organization was profoundly diverse. And something like 25% of the membership was composed of Black Americans, and another 5 to 7% of the organization was composed of non-Puerto Rican Latinos. And they organized campaigns around issues of health, sanitation. They occupied a hospital in the South Bronx in Chicago, where the organization first emerged as a reformed gang that worked closely with Fred Hampton, the leader of the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther Party. In that city, they worked against the displacement of Puerto Ricans and other poor and working class people in the city as a consequence of urban renewal, which was, in short, the gentrification, a kind of gentrification in that era. I mean, that's a really loose definition of urban renewal, but mostly they took on campaigns of social and economic import, which attracted people of all races and ethnicities.
So they're very much part of sort of the larger radical milieu of the 60s and 70s then. They embrace socialism, they embrace national liberation, they're involved with Fred Hampton. Is that a correct understanding of where they stood?
Right. They're a component part of what is known as the New Left. And the New Left is distinguished in that in its totality during the 1960s, the New Left transformed the relationship between Black people and white Americans. The New Left challenged the country's assumptions about issues of gender and sexuality, but also how the U.S. government conducts foreign policy. So that's why we study the New Left of the 1960s. It was a generation of young people, but also folks who had been active and involved in left politics prior to the 60s, who together took the reins of history in their hands and changed the culture, the political culture of American society. So the Young Lords are a part of the New Left. The organizations that are associated with the New Left are SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Students for a Democratic Society, the Black Panther Party, the Weather Underground, the series of women's organizations of the period that form part of second wave feminism, and the anti-war movement, which involved Vietnam veterans against the war.
So in addition to the New Left, I also know there's a very long struggle in Puerto Rico for Puerto Rican independence that the U.S. government has been absolutely brutal and merciless about repressing. But there's also its own sort of political tradition of independence movements. How does the Young Lords, as a predominantly working class, relate or fit into sort of the larger history of radical Puerto Rican movements or the Puerto Rican independence cause?
So that's a fascinating question, which I address in the book, especially the last chapter of the book, in part because the Young Lords decide that they were going to transplant themselves from their activism and organizing in the U.S. mainland to work for Puerto Rican independence on the island. So the young lords see themselves as the children of Don Pedro Albizu Campos, who's the father of Puerto Rican nationalism and a member of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, who was in fact a political prisoner in American prisons in the 1950s and 60s. He died in the mid-60s. And you're absolutely right that the U.S. government launched an unrelenting and unforgiving campaign of repression against Puerto Rican nationalism, in part because of the importance of Puerto Rico to U.S. imperialism. The United States launched all of its military campaigns in Latin America from the island of Puerto Rico, which it acquired as part of the Spanish-American War of 1898. And the Young Lords are important in that they are the first organization of Puerto Ricans born and raised in the U.S. mainland that coheres in part to free the island of Puerto Rico. But they're also a product not just of the longstanding movement for self-determination on the island of Puerto Rico and independence, but they're also a U.S. mainland formation. And in many ways, they are children of the urban rebellions and the movements for Black freedom that emerged in the northern United States during the 1950s and 60s. So they're a U.S. mainland phenomenon as much as they are part of this longer history of the struggle for Puerto Rican independence.
Who were some of the political influences on the Young Lords' thinking?
So again, the Young Lords form part of the period and the New Left. And like the Black Panther Party and other organizations, they're influenced by the politics of Mao Zedong. They're inspired and influenced by the Cuban Revolution of 1959 and the writings of Ernesto Che Guevara. But they're also reading Frantz Fanon's works, Wretched of the Earth, which was just some of the classic texts of the period. They're also reading Marx and Lenin and even Stalin. So they are self-proclaimed socialists who are heavily influenced by Maoist politics. They identify, like the Black Panther, initially the lumpen proletariat as the most revolutionary class in society, but that changes later in the history of the group. They're also influenced by the politics of an emerging women's movement and the consciousness raising circles that became popular as a result of the organizing of feminists during that period. And they're profoundly influenced by the politics of the Vietnamese who were fighting American imperialism in Vietnam.
So on Still Spying, we explore the history of FBI political repression in this country. And people who have been listening to this program will note at this point we've sort of made very clear the FBI does not like socialist, the FBI does not like anti-imperialism, and the FBI does not like racial justice or sort of liberation movements of the oppressed. How did the FBI view the Young Lords?
So how did the FBI view the Young Lords? I think that the Young Lords were surveilled like others during the period. I'll give you an example. I requested the FBI files of the Young Lords many moons ago, and there are thousands of pages of FBI surveillance of the group as it emerged in Chicago and then New York and spread along the northeastern corridor to Philadelphia and Hartford and Bridgeport and other cities like Newark. And one of the fascinating things is that as the Young Lords in New York begins to be written about in the New York Times because of its very colorful garbage dumping protests in East Harlem, which blocked traffic for blocks. At one point, their activism and burning of garbage in the major thoroughfare of East Harlem blocked traffic for 30 blocks. This caught the attention of the media, but also the mayor. And they were doing this not once, but this was a campaign they launched strategically over the summer months for 2 months. Daily, they were engaged in these protests and gaining attention, participation from people in the community, they grow in size and they decide that they're going to establish an office and formalize their presence in the neighborhood of East Harlem. And they rent a storefront, which becomes their office. And the FBI files show and outline that the informants within the organization, in fact, went to visit the superintendent who rented the office to the young lords. So it is very likely that the office was wired, that the FBI gained access to the office through the superintendent.
Were the young lords ever a target of any of the FBI's counterintelligence programs or COINTELPRO programs? I know the FBI with certain groups like the Black Panthers went beyond just surveillance and had these sort of covert neutralization programs directed against them. Does the young lords face that kind of repression or? So
absolutely. So these are the records that I'm referring to. These are the counterintelligence records of the COINTELPRO program of the FBI that are available now to the public and cite the activities in which the agents engaged in, and the agents are identified by code, and they join the organization and then attempt to create internecine struggles within the group. So absolutely, the Young Lords, from the moment it attempted to formalize its presence in New York, but also in Chicago, they were heavily infiltrated by agents. And the agents in the Young Lords were also corresponding with agents in the Black Panther Party that in Chicago that the Young Lords were involved with. Because the Young Lords in Chicago form part of the Rainbow Coalition, the coalition launched by Fred Hampton that brought together the Young Lords, Puerto Ricans and Mexicans in the Young Lords, poor whites from Appalachia, and of course, Black Americans in the Black Panther Party, a coalition organized across racial lines that argued that these groups had a shared class interest.
So in addition to the FBI, it was also local police like the NYPD who targeted the Young Lords. I know that you spent a decade trying to get the NYPD's Red Squad files. Could you explain what the Red Squad was and what you found out in these files about their treatment of the Young Lords?
Well, I'll go back to the COINTELPRO files, and I write about the files and the intervention of agents in the organization throughout the book, but especially in the last chapter. You should know that the person who led the organization right as the organization was going down like the Titanic, in part because of government repression, her name is Gloria Fontanez. She was the leader of the Young Lords. She married a COINTELPRO agent and had a child. And he created a really volatile, abusive situation in their relationship that she then took out on members of the organization. And there was a tremendous amount of psychological abuse and violence deployed against members of the organization through the tactics that were very targeted and well thought out psychologically on the part of COINTELPRO. And I talk thoroughly and explicitly about those campaigns in the last chapter of the book. But also what's fascinating is that the same COINTELPRO papers discuss in detail the ways in which agents might pit Puerto Rican nationalist organizations against each other. Literally, one of the files says that we need to intensify and deepen conflicts between personalities who might already see each other as competitors. So COINTELPRO really sought to just deepen pre-existing conflicts among members, between organizations. And ultimately, it succeeded because it sought to erode trust among people who previously saw each other as brothers and sisters and comrades. that kind of destabilization of human bonds leaves a profound psychological distrusting feeling and aura, atmosphere that stays with people for a long time.
How successful do you think these tactics were in undermining the goals of the Young Lords and the Young Lords as an organization?
Well, I think the Young Lords succeeded tremendously. They, for example, are credited with drafting the first known patient Bill of Rights when they occupied Lincoln Hospital in the Bronx with the blessing of radical doctors, but also workers at the hospital, non-medical workers and nurses. And they also are credited with the passage of anti-lead poisoning legislation. The Journal of Public Health in the mid-1970s said that the activism and militancy and muckraking of the Young Lords and all the press conferences they held, which embarrassed the city, finally led the city to pay attention and form the Bureau of Lead Poisoning and pass legislation. The Young Lords really changed the perception of Puerto Ricans, especially in a city like New York and a city like Chicago. Puerto Ricans were spoken about like Mexicans are spoken about today, as bad hombres. But they were also, interestingly enough, depicted as mild-mannered people. And the very defiant, strategic, intelligent organizing of the Young Lords in the public square changed that perception of Puerto Ricans, and in many ways gave Puerto Ricans a coming out party in New York. But they also popularized socialist ideas at the level of the community through their newspaper, through the political education events they had on a regular basis. And they made it appealing. I mean, aesthetically, they were on the edge. They were in the vanguard of the zeitgeist of the period. So the Young Lords were successful. So they were part of a period, and the period succeeded in changing the culture of the country. But in many ways, the lessons of that period, we might say, and this is perhaps an overstatement, is frozen in time because those organizations were not able to continue in a moment of retreat from mass organizing in the streets, because COINTELPRO succeeded in really producing a poisonous environment in these organizations and ending them.
Do you think we're still suffering from some of that fracturing to this day, or the impact of it at least?
Oh, absolutely. For sure. I think that there are individuals from the period who continue to be active in the movements of this period, but there's nothing like organizational infrastructure and collective analysis that comes out of the life of an organization to just assess the past, what happened, and how to move forward, or what was the best of what we did. We're getting that from writers and historians and people in the university who do important work, but they don't do work as revolutionaries on the ground. They're assessing the past at a remove from the comfort of a university. And that's definitely going to create a different kind of analysis that's perhaps not, I was going to say perhaps not as useful. I mean, it is useful in some ways, and perhaps not from the perspective of relaunching an organization or influencing a movement as it's beginning to emerge.
So we're at a moment in history where there's arguably a bit of a resurgent left. You see sort of people starting to call themselves socialist or democratic socialist again. You see sort of really powerful and inspirational Black Lives Matter protest, especially sort of the nationwide rebellion we saw after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor by the police. What do you think today's activists can learn from or draw from these stories?
Repression is going to come, and it's happening. I'm not sure if you know about the story of Anthony Smith in Philadelphia and others who were arrested by the feds about 3 weeks ago and charged with serious felonies, and they're expected to be convicted of crimes that will put them in jail for anywhere between 6 and 75 years. Ann Smith is a beloved Black teacher in Philadelphia, activist, and was identified as one of a number of fine Philadelphians by Philadelphia Magazine. Literally, the week before he was arrested and taken 3 hours from Philadelphia, and a judge denied him bail, and they had to appeal the process. It was a really complicated process. So this is happening now. So repression is going to come, and I think the Young Lords succeeded in protecting its membership from unnecessary arrests. They were very conscious of not engaging in activities that would redirect the focus of the organization around releasing people from jail or campaigns. So there's that we can learn. But also, I think what is important about the Young Lords and other radicals of the period and across time is that they were very clear on root causes of social problems. And their demands and campaigns reflected a clear understanding that, like Fred Hampton said, if we don't get rid of capitalism, we're not going to get rid of racism. And there was a clear sense that we needed to address white supremacy and racism, but we also needed to work across racial lines. And there were conversations about strategy, like what is it that we're fighting for and how are we going to get there? How are we, in fact, going to pull the levers of society that will force government to concede? And organization is paramount. Organization that's consistent and that seeks to bring broader networks of revolutionaries together toward a long-term project of revolution and against the system. So those are some of the lessons. Ultimately, the Young Lords are a product of the period, as are the Black Panthers and the rest of the New Left. And so the kind of aesthetic and approach of that period is not the aesthetic and approach for this one. But, how are we going to abolish the police? What is it going to take to abolish the police? And can the police be reformed? And if we're going to ask for reforms, what should they look like? Can the police be defunded? Those are questions that raise questions about the organization of society that have to be part of the demand to abolish police.
So I guess just before we go, is there anything you'd like to say about sort of your own sort of decade struggle to get the files from the NYPD Red Squad, and who the New York Police Department's Red Squad was and what it is you found in those files?
Okay, so that's a really long story that I want to tell, because this is what your show is about. So when I left graduate school a million years ago, Eric Foner, who was one of my advisors, suggested that I begin the process of registering Freedom of Information law requests and FOIA requests with the federal government. And I did as much. And interestingly enough, it's fairly easy to get the COINTELPRO papers. It's a lot harder to get police papers because police are not governed by anyone. They're pretty much their own bosses and they do whatever they want. I knew that there were plenty of files that were compiled by the NYPD because they surfaced in the COINTELPRO files, right? They were writing each other. And if you think about it, ultimately surveillance can't be conducted from afar at a remove from Washington. It requires local actors. And who are the local actors? The police. So in fact, those files are so much richer than those of the federal government and the FBI and COINTELPRO. So I was literally in a conversation by mail with the NYPD for 10 years. And one day I woke up pissed off and decided that I was literally going to walk into One Police Plaza because I live in New York and, talk sense into these people and tell them, listen, I'm from New York, you're from New York, let's cut a deal. And they said, oh, we're very familiar with your request, Professor Fernandez. We're about to make a decision and you're going to be very happy. A few months go by, I call them and they're like, yes, we're going to figure this out and you're going to be very pleased. 4 months later in April, I get a letter from them that says that they're going to dismiss my case on a technicality. And I was pissed off. This was 2014. And I was just angry because they were duplicitous. They led me on. And they knew that they were going to dismiss this the first moment I walked into One Police Plaza. And I literally got angry. I borrowed money and I hired a lawyer to sue them. And immediately, the New York Times calls me because I was the first person to file a lawsuit to recover segments of the lost handshoe files, the largest repository of police surveillance records in the country, over 1 million records, including those of Malcolm X, which a judge in 1985 ordered preserved at the Municipal Archive of the City of New York, which the cops didn't do. So I'm not sure if you are familiar with the handshoe files, but this is so important to your podcast and the history that you are attempting to disinter. So let's back up. Let's rewind the tape to the late 1960s. In fact, 1969. In March of 1969, the police department in New York City infiltrated the Black Panther Party and attempted to get members of the Black Panther Party to engage in conspiracy to bomb police departments and the Department of Education. So their agents were attempting to entrap members of the Black Panther Party. Of course, the Black Panther Party members didn't bite, but they were arrested. Many of them the Panther 21 were arrested as a result of this attempt at entrapment. But of course, at this moment, it's unclear what's going on and why these members are getting arrested. Over the course of the trial, which was the largest trial in New York City history at the time, the Black Panther lawyers in the National Lawyers Guild discover the police agents that are behind this very complex attempt on the part of the police to entrap Black Panthers through their agents that are posing as members in the party. Side note, all of those Black Panthers were involved in a takeover of a mental health clinic at Lincoln Hospital that attempted to make this mental health clinic address more authentically the interests of the community. So this was a community worker control of Lincoln Hospital, which was fascinating. It was a project in democracy. And of course, it was all of those members who were offering help to the workers at Lincoln Hospital who ended up getting arrested. And all of this is in my book. Fascinating history. So of course, that was a huge threat. The moment when the Young Lords begin to aid workers at a hospital who are redefining the workplace and its relationship to workers, but also to the community, boom, they get arrested. Over the course of this trial, the lawyers realize, oh my God, the police are the ones who should be arrested for the conspiracy that they are engaged in. And after the end of the Panther 21 case, and the Panther 21 are exonerated and released, the lawyers file a lawsuit against the NYPD known as the Handshoe case, named after Barbara Handshoe, one of the lawyers. And in it, they argue that the police department has violated the association clause in the free speech and association, that the Black Panthers and other members of the New Left, First Amendment rights have been violated, that people have the right to association without being targeted by the police. Anyway, this case lasts 10 years, from the early 1970s to 1985, in fact, almost 15 years. And the case is against infiltration on the part of the police by the cops, not by the federal government, but by the cops. And out of that, we win. The Handschuh case establishes that there's something called the right to free speech and association, and that the police cannot infiltrate or arrest people simply because they're associated with a group. And that in order for them to attempt to arrest or infiltrate or even investigate a group, they have to get permission from a judge and show cause. By the way, this is the law that Muslims use in New York City to protect themselves against police infiltration and harassment following 9/11. If you look it up, Handschuh, immediately what comes up is not the original Handschuh, but Muslims who with this law are taking the government to task. Little do Muslims know that it was the struggle to allow Black radicals to exist in New York City that allowed them this right to not be persecuted by the police. Fascinating. So those are known as the Handschuh rules that attempt to circumscribe the power of the police in New York vis-a-vis specific groups. Of course, they were whittled down after 9/11. But one of the things the Handschuh case concluded, the Judge Haight, that was his name, said was, not only am I going to establish rules of conduct for the police vis-a-vis political groups or any groups in the city and what the police can and cannot do, I also want New Yorkers to know what the police has done to citizens. And for that reason, I want all of these files that have been subpoenaed and that we've seen and studied, over 1 million records, to be deposited at the Municipal Archive of the City of New York for posterity. So New Yorkers will know. Well, the police never deposited them. And I was the first person to sue the police after this decree of 1985 for these records. And many, many people had requested the files. They had been denied them, and no one followed up. What's fascinating about these files, and I've not really had time to scour the record because I had to finish the book, but also because the police purged the damn files. So they purged the Young Lords files, because police are vindictive. But there were some things in there. What's fascinating about these files is that there's an enormous amount of surveillance that you can see, and there are police agents who are identified by number. And it's a lot of documentation of what the radicals are doing, but not just radicals, all New Yorkers. Like the church lady in the corner is being surveilled by the police at the height of the Cold War. What's fascinating is that these records are an archive of the life, literature, and activities of the left because they gathered everything. So the police brought in the papers, the flyers, the internal letters that activists were sending to each other. They collected everything. So it's a very, very rich repository, ironically, of movement life.
Professor Fernández, thank you so much for joining us. And for people who are listening and want to learn more about Professor Fernández's work on the Young Lords, her most recent book is called The Young Lords, A Radical History. This is the Still Spying podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at Still Spying, on Facebook, on the Facebook page Still Spying Podcast, or visit us online to sign up for updates at stillspying.org. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so very much for inviting me.